Hello and welcome to something a little different today. I've had some questions that have come in about the resurrection and about how do we know as Christians that this actually took place. So I thought it might be good to tackle the four main things that people raise as objections to the resurrection of Jesus. Now they say the greatest critic you'll ever meet is yourself, and so today I'd like to introduce you to our special guest will be putting these questions to me, and that gentleman is about to join us now. Okay, so yeah, I have got some questions about the resurrection because it seems to me there's lots of things here that we can't explain. So do you mind if I'd ask these questions? Because for me and a lot of people, these are the things that kind of, well, you know, it's difficult to understand all this. So first of all, I'd heard that Jesus wasn't actually dead and that he was in a coma, and that when the tomb stone was rolled away, the fresh air brought him to life. So what do you make of that then? That Jesus was in fact in a coma and not dead? So that's probably one of the more common questions about the resurrection. Was Jesus actually dead when he was in the tomb? Well, I think the answer to that is almost definitely, well not even almost, certainly yes. Bear in mind what's happened. Jesus has undergone a Roman flogging, a beating, before he's even crucified. And what does that mean? He'd have been probably whipped and beaten, suffered huge blood loss, and then been put on the cross. Many criminals were sent straight to the cross, we know, not flogged first. The Roman flogging was often a death sentence. You would die very simply from the loss of blood, the shock, and even if you did manage to hang on for a few days, without antibiotics, infection would quickly set in and it was highly unlikely you'd survive. But let's look at the evidence. The execution, firstly and most importantly, was overseen by the Romans. Now, the Romans were experts when it came to crucifixion. They certainly knew how to kill people. If they wanted to speed things up, they would break the legs of those they crucified so that they asphyxiated, they literally suffocate, because that's how crucifixion works. It's a fight between the trying to breathe or enduring the pain. You have to push yourself up and able to breathe, and after a period of time you tire. But with Jesus, checking he was dead, they actually thrust a spear into his side, and there's a wonderful demonstration of this in the film Risen. In that film they check that Jesus is dead and they insert the spear, and from the wound, as the Gospels record, out flows body fluid, blood and water, the spear probably going up underneath the rib cage, puncturing the lungs and the heart. So for the Romans, they were sure he was dead. And then you've got those who put him in the tomb. They carried the body to the tomb, they wrapped him in probably maybe 100 pounds in weight of spices, and then having done that, the body is of course wrapped in the cloths. Now, the suggestion that Jesus wasn't fully dead but in a coma basically says that at some point he wakes up. Now, he either rolls a massively heavy stone away himself, or if he doesn't do that, someone does it for him, but then they would have to know he's dead and there's a Roman guard outside, and how could they be sure? And secondly, it says that if he has come out of this coma, having then left the tomb, however he's got out, he then walks to Emmaus, where he meets people on the road and sits down and breaks bread with them. For a man who's just experienced that, they'd be barely alive. So I think the suggestion that he's been in some sort of coma or fainted is one that we can discount readily. The Romans, as I said, were experts in what they did when it came to crucifixion. So the reality is that no, he most certainly, well no again, no most certainly, he was dead. Okay, so he wasn't in a coma, he was dead. How do we know that somebody didn't just steal the body? Because I mean that's something I've heard a lot, that they just stole the body. That's why they've gone there and the tomb's empty. How do you account for that one? So what you're talking about there is called the theft theory. The idea being that the disciples came and stole the body. This is what the chief priests, the Sadducees, etc., this was the myth they put out. The disciples came overnight and they stole the body. Okay, well, let's just look at that realistically. Pilate had sent a detachment of Roman guards. Now, we think, because of films largely, of maybe 3 or 4 people outside the tomb guarding it. Jesus was hugely political in the sense that his death would cause upheaval in the city. Pilate could not risk this story of him being raised causing further unrest. And so a Roman guard, anyway, we know normally consisted between 60 maybe to 100 soldiers. He sent a good body of men there to guard that tomb. And bear in mind, where are the disciples? They've run away. They've in hiding. How would they get the people not only to go and move the stone, but take on this Roman guard that's in place? I think the suggestion the body could be stolen has no basis whatsoever, because if they had tried to steal the body, a group of Jewish men against a contingent of Roman guards fully armed, it's unrealistic to see that could possibly have taken place. And don't forget, most of the apostles died for their belief that they had seen the risen Jesus. Would you go to your death when you knew it was a hoax and you'd stolen the body? I think as well there's the moral aspect that they'd have misled thousands of people with the lie that Jesus was risen when they knew that they'd stolen the body. So I think that one as well, we can safely put that one to bed. Okay, so he's definitely dead and they've not been possible for them to steal the body. Then what's to say this is not just some sort of mass vision or hallucination? You know, that they wanted to see Jesus alive, and so in their minds they actually just all imagined it. What about that then? Some big hallucination. What would you say to that? So what you're talking about here is what's called the hallucination theory, and what that basically says is that Jesus, the risen Jesus, was a hallucination, or if you think of the fact that 500 people saw Jesus raised, that it was a mass hallucination somehow, and maybe some sort of mass hypnosis had taken place. Well, even if that were possible, the number of witnesses recorded in the book of Acts, how would you possibly do that and hypnotise that amount of people? But don't forget, if you look at things like the Gospel of Luke, chapter 24, verse 39, where it records they physically touched him, they felt him, he had flesh and bones, he cooked breakfast on the beach for them. They ate with him, they talked with him, and of course they touched him, as I've said. If it was a vision and a hallucination, then how would they have done those things? And how would 500 people all see the same thing exactly as if it was real? I think the suggestion that it was hypnosis is one that is tenuous at best. I think when we look at this theory of hallucination, yes, you can say that they are, of course, the disciples all full of grief and mourning, they're emotional, and that maybe that may lead to some sort of, in their minds, picturing that Jesus is real. But the Gospels and the book of Acts certainly don't suggest that. And other writers who record he was raised, resurrection in Jewish thought and in Jewish theology was not resurrection to the spirit. Resurrection was a physical resurrection of the body. And so the idea of it being a vision, I think we can discount. Don't forget as well also that the disciples were, if you look at the Gospels, people who were often slow to believe and cautious to believe. And you might even say they were sceptical at times, and yet they all come to share the common belief that they have seen the risen Jesus, and in some cases, of course, they see him together. So I think the idea this was a hallucination we can discount. Have you got another question? Okay, so he's definitely dead, they didn't steal it, and it's not a vision or hallucination, but I've also been told they went to the wrong tomb. Now if that's true, and they went to the wrong tomb, well of course Jesus isn't there. You know, what do you say about that? How do we know they went to the right tomb? They could have been mistaken. The classic wrong tomb theory. So this basically says that Mary and the other ladies went to the wrong tomb. And the kind of idea here is one propagated by a theologian called Kersop. And what Kersop basically said was, when they had a conversation with the gardener, or the person they thought was the gardener, when they went to the tomb, the gardener said to them, "He's not here." And then they rush off. And they rush off before the gardener has the opportunity to say, oh, he's over there, suggesting that he was about to direct them to the right tomb. Well, firstly, there's no evidence in the Gospels for that whatsoever. And secondly, let's remember what's gone on here. These women have seen Christ crucified and died. They have gone out to buy spices. They have seen the day before where he was laid. The tomb is also a new tomb. Now we have images perhaps in our minds because of modern society of huge cemeteries, but this area in Jerusalem at the time was not a huge area. In fact, go to Jerusalem today, it's not a big city, the old city area. And so a rich person's tomb would have been one you would have found fairly easily. But again, they saw him placed in there. So people suggesting that they kind of in their grief forgot where Jesus had been laid. I mean, how many of us in that situation, despite our grief, would forget? Often when we see something that's traumatic, it is imprinted in our memories. If you think about when John F. Kennedy was assassinated, most people who lived in that time can tell you exactly where they were when they heard the news that JFK had been killed. They're not going to forget where the tomb is and go to the wrong tomb. And I think all these questions are things that are trying to not just discredit the gospel accounts, but also in some senses give people a safe route to avoid the issue of the resurrection. Because what if I said to you, if Jesus is risen, what does it mean to you? What are you going to do about that? We've discounted that he wasn't in a coma, also that he was in a coma. We've discounted that they'd gone to the wrong tomb. We've discounted that it was hallucination, and we've discounted that it was a theft. But if they're the main four objections to the resurrection, the question now is, if they're out the way, then surely, if we work through it logically, this must mean Jesus was raised. So I suppose the question for anyone when they think about this and when they work through this and when they come to the realization that then Jesus must have been raised from the dead, the question is, how do people respond to that? And so I put that question back to you. How will you respond to the fact that Jesus is raised? Well, yeah. Certainly sounds like I've got a lot to think about. So if he wasn't in a coma and they didn't steal the body and it wasn't a hallucination and they definitely knew where the tomb was, then I suppose that means Jesus must have been raised. And that certainly left me with a lot to think about. And I hope you enjoyed that little video where we thought about some of the things that people ask when talking about the resurrection of Jesus. Just a different way of doing it, something to maybe brighten your day a bit, see the vicar talking to himself. But nonetheless, they are things that people genuinely ask about the resurrection. And so if you've thought about those things beforehand, then you're in a good place to explain those things to people when they ask. They're genuine questions. And I think people who are asking those questions want to hear some sort of reasoned answer. So just some simple facts for you today. I hope that they might be useful to you in the ministry that we all share of sharing the good news of Jesus Christ. And let's pray we might be able to have opportunities to do that, whether at work or at home, at school or university, wherever we may find ourselves. And do, of course, continue to pray that we might be able to meet together again soon. God bless you.